Hi, I hope you're well and welcome to this next meeting in the series of Making Sense of the Crisis on behalf of the People's Assembly. It is another week. I can't believe it's a week since our last meeting, and I imagine you've experienced so much in the last week. I know that I have had some real kind of mental highs and lows, and not being able to go out has such a huge impact. Thanks so much for joining this meeting. We've got some absolutely excellent speakers that I'm going to introduce in a second, but just stop what you're doing and share this meeting, please, so that we can get to as many people as possible. Of course, there are going to be political elements to this conversation. Why wouldn't we, in one of the biggest crises that we faced? Of course, we all have our political opinions, but it's also just a sense that people aren't alone in this struggle either, and we want as many people as possible to join, and those people that aren't necessarily always attracted to People's Assembly page, please visit the People's Assembly website too. The website can be put on the comment thread underneath this video, and there you can register for the newsletter. You can even donate to the People's Assembly. That would be fantastic. And yeah, just keep sharing this video throughout if you can, so we reach a larger audience. This last week, I think, has showed us so many worrying signs from the government. We've seen a scandal over testing, such a small amount of people being tested when it's so crucial to the strategy of keeping people well, the scandal over ventilators, the scandal over protective equipment, the scandal over those people who are still having to go to work and be exposed to the virus when they're in non-essential industries. All of that is undoubtedly going to be taking the toll on the mental health of the nation. And that's what we want to explore tonight. So yes, we're going to be thinking about individual mental health. How do you keep yourself mentally well in a time of national crisis? Something that in my lifetime, people a lot older than me have not experienced before. How do you stay mentally well? But also as a collective, what are we going to do? So I'm joined by three excellent guests tonight. As always, we are going to be taking your questions as well. So if you have got a question, can you just pop it on the comments underneath, and I can see that, and I'm going to be asking your questions. I've got some of my own, but it's much more interesting if they are yours. And as we did last week, we're going to be stopping at about 5 to 8 for the applause for the NHS, or the pan rattling, or the whooping, cheering, chanting, to show our gratitude to the absolute heroes that are working day in, day out in the NHS, and to all of the other key workers, actually, the teachers, the posties, the care assistants. I'll have forgot loads of very important people, but we're going to show our gratitude at 8 o'clock. Each speaker is going to set out what they think. Each speaker is an expert in their own field, if you like. We've got Karen Buckley, who's going to go first, Ellen Clifford from DPAC, and Dr. Mona Kamal. All of them are going to give you their insights, and as I said, they're all experts. We're going to start with Karen Buckley. She's a Unison rep, she's a People's Assembly activist, and she's a psychological therapist. And I'm going to be quiet now, Karen, hand over to you to tell us what you think about how to keep well mentally, about what you're experiencing in your field. Thank you very much.
Hi. Thanks for listening, everyone. It's a really strange and confusing time, I think, for everyone. And I think it'd be really useful for people to maybe understand what they're feeling and why they're feeling it. So because it's really normal to be anxious. One of the things is that people don't always realise is our brains are wired for survival rather than for happiness. And so at this particular time that we're feeling quite threatened, and it's confusing, it's strange, it's uncertain. So all those sorts of things are quite threatening. And so I think it'd be really useful for just explain a little bit that our brains are like prehistoric people that lived in tribes and things. So how we respond to threat is similar now than it was then. It's not changed. Evolution has not caught up. So if we sense that we were going to be attacked, we'd immediately get an adrenaline rush, which would send us into what's called fight or flight. So we'd run away or fight, or if we can't do that, we'd freeze. But what happens is our bodies create an awful lot of energy very, very quickly to run away. So to do that, we start breathing more fast. we start to, our heartbeat speeds up to get the oxygen into the big muscles so we can run away. Our digestion slows or stops so the energy can go into running away. So we get like a big split of like glucose going into our bloodstream. Our attention becomes much more alert and, you know, focused on threat. And so it's almost like it'll stop some of the intellectual bits and make you want to run away. Well, the same thing happens if it's a psychological threat. So if you're getting worries about what's going to happen with my job, you know, I've not got enough money, I can't pay my bills, I'm all alone, I'm going to be alone forever, you know, I feel inadequate, useless, you know, I've lost another job, all that kind of thing, you know, is going to make us feel really quite threatened and very anxious. And if you're not running away or fighting, all that energy's in your body collecting, and you're going to be feeling really unsettled. You're going to feel quite maybe a bit snappy, you know, and just feeling really uncomfortable in your body. So it's really important to realise that, and if that carries on, you'll actually get quite depleted because it's taking a lot of energy, and it will probably lead to depression. So it's you know, so it's just realising all these things that are probably going on for you at the moment. And so obviously we've also had 10 years of austerity, you know, which has also caused lots of threats, lots of worries for people. We live in a culture that puts profits before people. It's got a very narrow definition of success. So a lot of people can feel quite inadequate anyway and feel worried and anxious. So, you know, we live in a very atomized society as well. So people are quite alone a lot of times with lots of things going around in their minds. So then we get a coronavirus outbreak on top of that. And I think one of the problems we've got is we've had a government that for too long had this herd immunity theory, and it was just a theory that's now been discredited. You know, and so that's created a lot of confusion, you know, and non-action, and then they changed track. And so you've got a lot of people out there who, you know, what should we be doing? Because for ages people thought they could still go out, and then it's no, we can't. And, you know, so you've got all this confusion. And then when people actually did realize what's happening, you got lots of people running to supermarkets, but probably because it felt like something they could control. And so that was something that they did do, you know. And so, you know, it was really uncertain because the World Health Organization was saying in late January what we should be doing, you know, which wasn't happening. So we've got that. And if I think about some of the clients I've had last week, we've had all the common problems like people, how am I going to manage on £94.25 a week? People who've still got to work and they're worried about relatives. Some have got like, someone said to me, I've got, my mum's got asthma and so has my sister, and it's really severe, but I'm having to work, and she works in a supermarket. You know, and so people who can't get through on universal credit, we've had a few people with that one. You know, and then people worrying about what if they end up in hospital, because everyone's heard about the crisis in hospitals as well. You know, so people are worried about the things that there's not enough PPE for, you know, for key workers, whether that's in hospitals or care workers. So that's personal protective equipment. You know, they're not testing enough, so there's not enough staff working. There's not enough ventilators. People are worried about that. And so a lot of people are feeling really, really anxious in that way as well. And then there's the problems of lockdown, especially people who live alone. That sends in our tribal brain again, because if you're feeling disconnected from people and you're feeling very alone, part of our brain that is very tribal and would have only survived in the group, because people who lived, you know, I don't think people actually lived in caves, but anyway, you know, that if you didn't live in a group and you was banished from that group or that tribe, you'd probably die. And so to feel alone and pushed out of a group or isolated can actually make you feel very, very anxious. So there's all those people as well. And I think as well, just people just feeling, you know, trapped inside. And so we've got all that as well. I think domestic violence is increasing, which is another issue. There's a lot of grief over plans and things like that. So it's really important to see that our threat brain will be on full alert here and to look at how we can deal with that. And I think that one of the reasons possibly, and this is just my theory, that people are maybe have been saying the Tories are doing a good job, though I'm not sure they are quite so much today, is that, you know, maybe people have needed that security, they've needed that strong leadership, and it's better to think that they're doing something and to make some excuses for the government in some ways. But that's normal, really, because we really want security at this time and, you know, strong leadership. So really what I'm saying is that for now, we need to really look at that self-care really more than ever. So working in my job, that's what we look at all the time. So one of the things is that you're going to have probably a lot of energy, a lot of, you know, pent up energy. So it's actually really useful to do something, you know, that if you just sort of sat worrying and it's just going around in your mind, or you lay in bed thinking there's nothing to get up for, or, you know, maybe eating too much, self-medicating with alcohol, whatever, it's really good to maybe get up and do something practical, physical, something that's meaningful to you, you know, or talk to someone you trust. So a lot of people go running for the mental health, so that's a good one. And I know that there's lots of apps and videos at the moment around that people could maybe use. You know, there's an NHS site at the moment. I'll just check. It's www.nhs.uk/1U, one word, and that's really good because that can really help. And so that's got a lot of apps as well on it that you can use. It's things like doing creative activities can be really useful. And it's also important to think about, is there something I can do about the worry? If there's something you can do it, because it's a very active energy, you know, so do that. If it's something you can do nothing about, got no control or whatever, it's really good then to maybe look at doing something else. But, you know, if there is something you can do, go and speak to someone, get some help to try and problem solve it. It is good to do the breathing, because when we're anxious, we'll overbreathe. So it's good to maybe look at an app for breathing techniques, relaxation, because we'll be very tense. Mindfulness, but maybe a moving one is really useful. And if you're getting low and depressed, it's a bit like a flat battery. Depression's really, it's like feeling like a flat battery. It's really important to try and rev that engine when you're feeling low, rather than just say, I'm too tired, I can't be bothered. If you do something and, you know, it gets it going again. So it's really worth doing that. And also try to be kind to ourselves. That's really important, is to try and be kind to yourself. A lot of people are very critical. You wouldn't do that to someone you really love and care about. So it's about really treating yourself how you would do someone you really care about. I know I've got to wind up now, so okay, all right, thank you.
Oh, you could have had a little bit longer. Sorry, passively aggressively messaging behind the scenes, everyone. That's why Karen finished probably about 20 seconds early. So thank you for that. But I don't know, there were some very, very helpful tips, and it is good to remind ourselves as well what is physically happening to our bodies when we get into that state of panic. Why does that happen, and how we can kind of bring ourselves down from that. I'm not going to pretend that I've been outside of an experience of extreme worry. Actually, in the last 3 weeks, I've had those experiences on and off, and it is good to remind ourselves that this isn't an individual thing. Actually, it's probably us responding in the face of what is a serious crisis. And some of the things we spoke about are, we might speak about in the questions in just a minute, are contrary to kind of what's shoved down our throats, isn't it? It's like, be happy, you know, show this very, very pretty and beautiful life on Instagram, when obviously the reality is sometimes so much different. I think as well, I don't know if anyone else has felt this, maybe at home as well. It's like a yearning for connection, because there's only so much like the computer can give you. There's something a bit extra when you're actually in the room with someone. So I will very much look forward to getting back out in those spaces. But just shows you how invisible some of our community suffering is, because there's lots of people who cannot go out, that aren't spoken about unless we're in this kind of crisis. I am going to be quiet now, because I'm very proud to introduce Ellen Clifford from DPAC. DPAC stands for Disabled People Against the Cuts. When I was a Member of Parliament, I was so inspired by this group. Direct Action, they're activists, they put so much pressure on this government about the welfare state. And I'm very proud to say that Ellen has written a book called The War on Disabled People, published by Z Books, which is coming out soon. Maybe you could tell us at the end of what you're about to say how we get that book, because it sounds fascinating. Over to you.
Thanks, Nora. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of a disabled activist who myself lives with mental distress. To begin with, I just want to do a quick note on terminology. At DPAC, we follow the social model of disability. So according to the social model, we distinguish between the impairments, which are the conditions we live with, and disability, which is oppression that's imposed on top of our impairments by society. So we're disabled by society, not by our impairments. I therefore identify as a disabled person. I know not all mental health survivors and service users do, but today when I'm referring to disabled people, I'm referring to a wide group of people that includes people living with mental distress. So my personal experience of lockdown has been one that an intensive therapy course that I'd waited years to start has just been interrupted. Don't know when it's going to be starting again. And I'm also midway through switching medication from something I've been on for about 20 years. And the professional support that I need to manage that is kind of quite limited, but in the grand scheme of things, now I've got my head around those uncertainties. What I'm experiencing is quite minor compared to other people. As a person who experiences social anxiety, there are ordinarily in my life many, many days when I can't leave the house, when I can't speak to anyone. So lockdown isn't really different in many ways. And in fact, there's just a kind of a lack of the pressure I usually feel to have to be in contact with people and do things that I find difficult. And over the years, I've built up lots of strategies for dealing with spending lots of time on my own, and also living with the fact that my brain is basically hardwired into permanent fight or flight. So yeah, I've always had to develop strategies for managing that. And I don't have any physical health conditions, so I don't have to self-isolate. So I'm keeping quite busy, being useful, getting shopping and delivering to DPAC friends and family in my area who are having to self-isolate, and having that purpose, I think, has been really helpful for me. But lots of people haven't been so lucky, and lots of disabled people are having very varied experiences of the crisis. For many people, there's been a sense of welcome to my world. After years of cuts and austerity, many disabled people had already lost the ability to go out and participate in life. Many of the support services that people with mental distress used to rely on, like day centres, have been closed for quite a long time now. So feelings of fear and isolation, anxiety about the future had already become a real everyday part of our lives. Our experiences of life, such as inaccessible, inflexible workplaces, such as a benefit system that isn't fit for purpose, are now being experienced more widely. And that means that disabled people are feeling, in some senses, less marginalised, that other people are sharing our everyday experiences now. And some disabled people have been expressing on social media that they now actually feel more connected than ever before, as non-disabled people start exploring accessible options for remote participation, such as these online meetings. Networks like DPAC, we already had in place routine practices for communicating with each other, and providing strong peer support through communication, the accessible communication that didn't rely on face-to-face support. Many of us haven't been able to go out very much for years. And now we have non-disabled people joining in with that too, so we feel more connected. But then on the other hand, there are disabled people, for whom this is a really, really terrible experience. A lot of people don't have online access, of course. Consequences for people in mental health crisis are quite severe. We've heard that social distancing isn't happening on psychiatric wards. We've also heard of acute wards being closed to make room for coronavirus patients. There are lots of reasons why lockdown presents a very real danger to disabled people, and therefore, it's understandable that people will be experiencing quite extreme anxiety, and there'll be an exacerbation of existing mental distress. So, for example, lockdown can mean the loss of contact from friends and family that you usually rely on for support. Crisis care that is available at the moment is negligible. For example, like crisis cafes that we can usually access when we're in a really bad place that are closed at the moment. With many support services cut back, the GPs become the main point of contact for a lot of people, but of course, access to our GPs at the moment is really restricted. There's the issue of pharmacies having trouble with deliveries, affecting our access to our medication. It's positive that conditionality and sanctions have been stopped for a while, and that universal credit has been uprated, which, by the way, are things we need to fight to keep and make permanent. But for people who might be about to make an appeal or midway through a benefits appeal, they now face a long, indeterminate period without access to the level of award that they should be getting and they need. Then for people with physical impairments living in the community and needing daily support from personal assistants coming into their homes, the situation is extremely serious. They don't have access to protective equipment for the PAs coming in and out of their homes while being in a very high risk group. These are people who won't probably get medical treatment, probably won't even be admitted to hospital, let alone prioritised for treatment if they do become ill. So this is very worrying. Decisions about disabled people's quality of life is something that's made by medical professionals all the time, not just in the pandemic situation. So the lack of value placed on the lives of people with impairments is something we're very familiar with. But now we've got the government openly saying if people with certain conditions get ill, they won't get treatment. And Deepak's recently seen copies of letters being sent out by GPs asking for permission to complete advanced do not resuscitate notices for people who aren't even ill yet. So that's very frightening for people. Additionally, the issue of people who need to self-isolate because they are in an at-risk group not being able to get delivery slots for vital supplies of food and medication. Another significant concern we're faced with is for people living with domestic violence, from which there's no escape in a lockdown situation, and for children witnessing or themselves experiencing violence and abuse without the respite of being able to go to school. I mean, this is storing up many, many psychological problems for the future. And when this is over, there's likely to be widespread post-traumatic stress across the whole population. I think the increased sales of alcohol do indicate that many people are finding this all very emotionally, psychologically difficult, and they're self-medicating. So what can we do to cope? I think it's important for people to stay busy and to feel that they have a purpose. There's certainly a lot to be campaigning for at the moment, such as PPE and testing. Deepak would urge people to think about who you know who may be isolated and experiencing the kind of issues I've covered, and to reach out to them, being aware different people may have different communication access needs and preferences. For everyone, I'd say that mindfulness can be beneficial. Karen touched on that. A lot of people, myself included, are very cynical about how mindfulness can be misused to push an individual resilience model of mental health, you know, where you've got workplaces teaching mindfulness to staff, then if they get stressed due to unreasonable working conditions, it's their own fault for not practicing their mindfulness. You know, individual resilience models of mental health can be used to distract away from very real material socio-economic problems. However, I would say if used correctly, different mindfulness practices can be very helpful. I try and use those myself, and it's a case of finding what works for you. And I think the tips that Karen gave were very useful. And I guess lastly, I'd encourage people to try and see this as an opportunity to step away from the grind of everyday life and to take time to stop and think, but whilst making sure you don't turn too much in on yourself, remembering the importance of maintaining some level of practical activity as far as you're able to under these conditions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Everyone's excellent at timekeeping, like much better than me. You mentioned so many important points there, and I think one of the points that you touched on actually struck me, and I'd heard it from somebody before, is that some activists that I know who have been campaigning for a different social security system said they felt a slight sense of betrayal actually with some of the kind of outrage about statutory sick pay, and some of the, the level that it's paid at, and how terrible the universal credit system can be. And as you said, welcome to my world, that actually there are thousands of people that have been experiencing this for a long time. Nikki Evans as well said that, there are bound to be very practical things that go wrong and exacerbate people's struggles. That Nikki Evans said that, and they're a British Sign Language worker, that deaf people are getting texts from their GPs saying that they'll call them, so very practical things that are, gonna exacerbate people's experiences. I think you point as well, before we move on to Dr. Mona Kamal, about mindfulness and strategies. I don't know if anyone else felt like this, maybe people who are watching, that in that first week of lockdown, and I'm in a position where I can't really leave the house. It was like a sensory overload, like do PE, do crafts, paint something, like why aren't you a domestic goddess by now, and it, I'm sure some of those things will be very, very, very helpful, but it's also worth remembering that, we're not failures either if we don't partake in all of those different things to kind of keep us busy. That can also be a pressure, can't it? We're going to take some questions, but it's my privilege now to introduce Dr. Mona Kamal. She's an NHS psychiatrist. It's over to you.
Thanks, Laura. Can I just check, can you hear me all right? Yeah? Yep, brilliant. So yeah, my name's Mona. I'm an NHS psychiatrist. I work in South London. So thanks for having me. And I think the other two speakers have spoken about it already, but it goes without saying that this is an extraordinary and abnormally challenging time that we're living through. There's been a tremendous amount of upheaval and loss of our routine, loss of our normal support networks through the isolation, and loss of our general sense of security that we may have, some of us may have taken for granted. And I think this is all the more disturbing because of how abrupt that's been. So in a matter of like 72 hours with little warning, our day-to-day lives became almost completely unrecognizable. And then that anxiety is further compounded by the fact that those in positions of power, those who have significant influence and control over our experience during this crisis, they've actually proven themselves to be not trustworthy and not reliable, and has simply not been able to gain control of the situation. So that's just compounded the anxiety even more. And with all of this, there's going to be a whole range of difficult emotions that we're going to experience that are actually quite appropriate and understandable within the context of what's happening. So what we call a reactive anxiety or a reactive depression, which is like a proportionate response to the sudden challenges that we're having to face. So in thinking about how to make sense of this and some strategies to use to deal with it, I've sort of for the sake of this, I've divided it into two parts. So the first one is thinking about the individual strategies that we can use to improve our well-being. So changes that we can make to our behaviors, our perceptions, and the way we interpret stuff going on around us. But I think that approach can actually be quite limited, and it tends to individualize the issue, and it misses that broader context that we're living in, which is so crucial. So I also then want to talk about what we can do collectively, and also more importantly, how we can feed what we're doing collectively now into the demands that we make when this crisis is behind us. So just like some simple strategies to begin with. I think it's important to try and stay as accurately informed as possible, gather information that will help you understand your risks so that you can make reasonable precautions, and make sure that you're using credible sources. I'm going to post a lot of links in the comments later about sort of some worksheets and links that are useful. But some of the trustworthy ones, so the World Health Organization website, the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges is really good at the moment, looking specifically at mental health and well-being. The Royal College of Psychiatrists is really good as well. I think it's important, though, to kind of limit the time spent taking in all this information. And if you find yourself excessively ruminating over stuff, it might be useful to create what we call worry windows. So this is a cognitive behavioral technique, which sounds quite counterintuitive, but it's basically where you put aside a certain amount of time, so 15, 20 minutes a day, for thinking about the things that are worrying you, and perhaps putting it in writing. Writing out everything that's concerning you so that it's outlined in a concrete list can itself be quite therapeutic. And it's also useful to notice what ideas or thoughts are underlying those beliefs that might be creating the anxiety, and keeping a track of them. And there are some like mood trackers, some links to work that I can put in the comments later. And I think a key strategy, I mean, Ella spoke about the individual resilience model, and I agree with that completely. And I think things like cognitive behavioral therapy, they have a really bad rap, quite rightly, because of that, because of the tendency to individualize problems, and the way it's used as kind of quick and easy symptom control rather than going anywhere deeper and looking at the root of a problem. But I think in the situation that we're in, where there's a clear, unidentifiable stressor, and we do want sort of kind of simple strategies and techniques to alleviate the anxiety quickly, those kind of techniques can come into their own. So what that means, what does that mean in practice when I say kind of cognitive behavioral strategies? It's about, like, in those moments when we're feeling overwhelmed with negative emotion like anxiety or sadness, it's about pausing for a moment and, well, first of all, trying to name it. It's impossible to start processing something if you haven't first accurately kind of identified it and named it and said what it is. And then once you've done that, pause and spend some time examining what are the thought patterns that are going on in our minds that might be driving that feeling. And the key thing is to examine whether the thought patterns or the beliefs that are driving the anxiety, are they accurate, or are they faulty, distorted ideas? And then if we can notice and correct any kind of faulty thinking patterns, then the negative emotions can start to lift as well. So by faulty thinking patterns, examples of that are things like over catastrophizing, for example. So is there a belief that only the very worst outcome will happen, which might not be an accurate assessment of the situation? Is there a tendency to filter out positive stuff that's affecting our mood? Projecting too far into the unknown, into the future, for example, and coming to a false conclusion based on that. So it's about noticing these things and bringing the focus back into the current moment and being present in that. And ultimately, it's about noticing what are the harmful patterns of thinking, and just staying curious about how those patterns of thinking can be influencing our mood, both positively and negatively. And then challenging them with self-compassion. And I think just drawing on the skills that you've developed through dealing with previous adversities in life. So whether it's meditation or religious practice, keeping physically active, staying in close contact with people that we trust, and also just remembering basic self-compassion as well. So just being able to accept ourselves in the situation for what we are and how we're managing it. And also really remember that it's extremely difficult to begin making sense of a trauma while you are still in the immediate physical danger stage, and that's pretty much the stage we're in at the moment. So don't make that demand on yourself. You know, give yourself some space and slow down and just sort of take care during this period. So those are some of the things that, you know, that we can do as individuals. But really, I think what I'd rather focus on really is what we can do collectively. And I don't think it's possible to talk about well-being and mental health without, you know, remembering that moment of collective elation last week with the NHS clap. and the power of us all coming together in that way was probably the most uplifting moment of the last 2 weeks. And similarly, the way everyone's come together in getting involved with the mutual aid groups, which have sprung up and down the country. So within a week of the lockdown being announced, 200 of those groups were created. And I think if this crisis can achieve anything, I hope that it's the burying once and for all of this idea that there's no such thing as society, and that we're all just individuals and insular family units looking out only for ourselves. That's what I hope that it can get rid of. You know, those values that are at the core of capitalism, of, you know, competitiveness and individualism. Somewhere along the way, we've been persuaded that these are like our values and our human nature. And aside from being a pretty poisonous idea, this crisis has demonstrated that the opposite is true. You know, humans are physiologically designed to thrive off of connection and solidarity. You know, we're creatures of massive cooperation. And we crave not just being connected with each other, but also being of service to each other, which is something that we don't hear about very much. And I think our most treasured institution, which is, you know, the NHS, is loved precisely because of the fact that it's been built, you know, on these principles of collectivism and solidarity and looking after each other. And I think we're seeing that need for connection and looking after each other satisfied a lot more now in this current crisis, paradoxically, than in ordinary times. And I think that's what ultimately is going to be getting us through this. And another thing we're seeing is how the way society is organized normally does not prioritize this kind of connection, and that this is having a very negative impact on our well-being. You know, in fact, you know, Karen was talking about a society being atomized, and that's absolutely right. And isolating ourselves away from each other, and seeing ourselves as individuals, you know, with competing interests. Those are the perfect conditions for a society that's racked with status anxiety and with narcissism. And that's what we really need to start thinking about undoing. And I think what this crisis, it's doing that already, and it's showing us what a different society that's built on, you know, those principles of cooperation and collectivism, like what that could look like, and how much more edifying and meaningful our lives could be under a system like that. I think I'm running out of time. I wanted to talk about changes that need to happen in our relationships with work and productivity, but I think I'll finish there. I think it's just important to remind ourselves that, you know, while this virus doesn't discriminate itself, there are certainly some of us who are buffered away from its worst effects a lot better than others. And I think it's those inequalities that we 100% have to be challenging when this is all over. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. And I really agree with that I agree with everything you said, but the last point too, that of course it doesn't impact, like any kind of disaster, any kind of crisis, it doesn't impact equally. Whilst the virus can obviously be caught by anyone, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of workers who are still having to go out because of those exploitative employers who are using that status of key worker for non-essential work. As I said at the end, if you have got those stronger employment rights, of course you feel more confident to say, no, I am self-isolated, or I live with somebody who is vulnerable, so I'm not going to come to work. If you're represented by a trade union and you feel the strength of that, then you'll feel like you don't have to take some of those risks. It's not people who are irresponsible being driven out the door to work, is it? It's, you know, that people need to pay the bills, they need to feed their family, and I'm sure lots of people wouldn't go to work in this crisis if they didn't have to, for those non-essential industries. We've had lots of comments, and maybe you could weave in anything that any of you didn't say in some of your answers that are going to come. One of the points that was raised was more of a a statement, but I just want to add on a little question. So Debbie said, there are clear and identifiable stressors, and I feel overwhelmed at times. I am mostly furious with this government and the false info brackets lies they are spreading. I do not trust this government to do the right thing by the NHS or the vulnerable. And in that sense, so that's her opinion, in that spirit of Debbie's opinion, what would you say to people that say we should not politicize this crisis? You know, I've had lots of comments where people have said this is a cheap hit, you know, just get on with it as if it's some kind of foreign nation trying to invade, you know, get behind your government, stop criticizing. What would you say to that? Can I come to you first, Karen? Is that all right?
I'm just unmuting. Yeah, well, I'd say that we do have to criticise, because then we're just going along with it, aren't we? We're just colluding with some things. Like if we did not protested about, you know, that people do need to be paid, or we're not saying anything about, you know, testing or protective equipment for key workers, or, you know, the ventilators. If we don't say anything about that, then what does that say about us, that we're not doing anything? So I think it's really important that we do. You know,
what about you, Ellen? How do you kind of counteract that sentiment when people are sometimes quite aggressively saying that people who are criticising the government are actually being the unhelpful ones in this situation?
The thing is that it's already political before we start politicizing it, if you like. I mean, the effects and the inequalities in how COVID-19 is impacting on our society have come about because of the government and the ideology that has been in place for the last 10 years. It wasn't inevitable that the coronavirus would hit in the way it has or be as damaging as it was if it wasn't for decisions that have been made over the last 10 years. It's already political. I think it's important to use this opportunity to help people understand why those political choices that have been made over the last 10 years have led to this situation, but also how we can change it, how we can come out of this and address it so that the future is better.
Mona?
Yeah, I mean, I remember during the dispute around the junior doctors contract being told a lot, you shouldn't be getting involved in politics, you should be looking after your patients, focus on that. And it is politics that is damaging our ability to care for patients. It's down to political decisions that we're now at the point at which we've got the lowest number of NHS beds in history. You know, it's down to political decisions that we're, you know, missing 40,000 nurses from our wards. So of course this is political. Any decisions that are being made around the NHS are political. It's completely political that, you know, we're desperately short of protective equipment, and that we have only tested 0.1% of the NHS workforce. We've only tested, you know, a couple of thousand, 2,000 NHS workers for the virus. And I think in the 6th richest country in the world, this isn't because we don't have enough resources or we don't have the clinical expertise or the knowledge. It's down to political decisions, you know, decisions that politicians are making to not roll out the tests in time. You know, the warnings were there for weeks and weeks and weeks, and there were deliberate decisions not to heed those warnings. So of course it's political. Politics pervades everything, and especially when it comes to our quality of life and our health and well-being.
I think one of the most frustrating things that I used to hear the Tories say in the chamber of the House of Commons was when we raised any of these issues that all three of you have raised, and they'd say that we were running the NHS down. Yeah, you're running it down, you're talking it down, you're talking the country down, from a position of not having the resources, the power, that raising these issues was somehow, I don't know, even seeped into sometimes like unpatriotic. It was a very strange sentiment, but has to be strongly fought. Jim Scott, by the way, said it's great to hear Ellen speak and that Deepak have been a massive inspiration to him. I wanted to ask a question from somebody called Sue. It's quite an interesting one and hypothetical. What would health professionals and authorities and volunteers do to create an emergency mental health service for these strange and difficult times? What would good look like, if you like? I don't know who wants to go first. Ellen? Sorry.
I think access to support to start with is just really important. The problem is that over 10 years, a lot of the support that we did rely on has been cut back. So what is there is already inadequate. For example, like I said earlier, a lot of people's main point of contact now is just the GP. A lot of, because of lockdown, because of resources being used, like I was saying about the wards being used for coronavirus patients, it is severely impacting on people's access to the support that they need. But also I think support does need to come ideally from professionals with an understanding of it. Some interventions can be dangerous if they're not done properly. I think we need to really fight for the support being in place for people that we need at the moment. Otherwise people are going to escalate, there's going to be crises. It's a terrible situation waiting to happen.
And Karen, what is the one thing that you would campaign for in your professional life?
Well, it would be because of austerity. I got involved in activism because the NHS was losing so much funding, and I was worried about it getting privatised as well. And what I can see with mental health services, not so much mine, but certainly across the board, mental health services have just lost so much funding. And then there's so many nurses that have left, so many services have gone. That service users that had the more severe and enduring mental health issues, they're just absolutely gone. So people go into crisis before they're getting any support, and that's not what we want. We don't want it. Costs a lot of money. It's very, very distressing and traumatic for people. And so I think that we need to get those services back for those people, because it is really tough for them.
And Mona, if you were in charge of all of this, if you had to direct the NHS to do what you said it should do now, and you had the resources, what would change for you?
Okay, so I think Karen's right. The under-resourcing in terms of the cuts, the takeovers by the private sector, these things have gutted the mental health services in this country. There's absolutely no doubt. But I think sort of specifically what I would want to see is the transfer back of the services that have been outsourced to the private sector being brought back into the NHS and the funding following that. I think the main crisis, I think, that I see impacting the patient experience day to day is about the availability of psychiatric nurses. So we've lost, as well as losing a third of all beds in the last 10 years, we've lost something like 9,000 mental health nurses. And that's the thing that is making it difficult for us to keep our wards safe. I think in the question that Sue asked about what we can do ourselves in terms of kind of voluntary work and the input that we can provide each other during this crisis, because this is quite an extraordinary crisis, and it's unlikely that NHS mental health services are actually going to be able to meet the need adequately. So I think there are things like mental health first aid courses that people can go on. The resources that I mentioned, just to kind of get a little bit more understanding of these techniques. And yeah, I mean, through the mutual aid groups, having mental health first aiders within that, I think would be a really excellent step, and that's something that we could, take up going forwards even after this crisis.
And I suppose what somebody else, Bolshi, and I'll just give the sentiments because it's quite a long message, talked about the strain on professionals. If you're seeing clients without food, I know teachers are extremely worried about how children are going to get food for those that qualify for pupil premium, that the postal service are worried about infecting houses and trying to keep themselves safe without adequate resources, and I suppose it's just the massive strain on all of you, and we can't have one of these every single night just on this to feel connected. So I think all of the things that you have raised tonight have been immensely helpful, because we do need to keep reminding ourselves that yes, some of this is normal, a normal response to what's happening. Yes, there are very clear political things that we can campaign on. We should not be ashamed of that. We should not be ashamed of calling the government out when they are failing. It's quite staggering that joining in the calling out is Piers Morgan and the Daily Mail. Whoever would have thought that? But we have a moral responsibility for all of those people that don't have a voice, don't have a platform to raise these issues with the government. We have about 3 minutes left before we're going to go off to show our appreciation to the NHS. Do you want to give us, I don't know, 30 seconds of a wind up, of a message to people who have been watching about what they, I know it's a bit unfair, about what they can do in the coming weeks, collectively and for themselves? I'm going to start with Mona.
I think it's just remembering again that, we are in the midst of this storm, and we're not going to be able to make proper sense of it until we're out the other side. So don't make those sorts of excessive demands on yourself. So it's okay to feel overwhelmed, and it's important to just take a break and to slow down and be able to take care of yourself through that. And I think, part of being a human being means that, we are maybe visited by these catastrophes every now and again. That's just part of being human. And it's about remembering how, some of us are buffered from the worst effects of these catastrophes and are able to keep ourselves safe a lot better than others, because of the rampant inequalities that are ongoing in our society. And a more equal society is better for all of us, from the point of view of our mental health and well-being, every single measure, actually, not just well-being. So that's what we need to be addressing. That's what we need to be demanding when we're out the other side of this.
Karen?
Keep me into a mood. I think it's really important that we need to be, look after ourselves and look after each other. One of my favourite quotes is by Audre Lorde that said, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." It's quite a strong statement, but I do think that looking after each other and ourselves is really important. And if there's something you can do for somebody else, do it. And if there's something you can do to look after you, do it.
Thank you so much. Ellen, you've got the closing words.
I think what the last 10 years of austerity and welfare reform have taught me is the importance of participating in collective activity. As Mona was saying earlier, that can really help us to realise that we do have the power to effect social change when we come together. I mean, we live under an oppressive system, but we can also be powerful when we unite our resistance. So I think more coming together, go for it.
And we will certainly have the mechanisms for that after this, because we are having to rely on each other like never before in these circumstances. Honestly, thank you so much for all of your contributions. I'm not just saying this, but I actually do feel a bit better after this conversation. Please, everyone who's been listening, can you share this? Because there's going to be some important links added that can help us through this, and people can watch back as well. So it's not just a live event, it's a resource for people out there. Next week, so Thursday at exactly the same time, we're going to be looking at key worker voices, so trying to get the voices of those who are still out there working, helping us through this crisis, elevated. And we're going to be joined by the General Secretary of the CWU, Dave Ward. So thank you very much. Let's go make some noise for the NHS. Bye.